Back home in Colorado, there's a woman that I love being in Bible studies with. No matter what the passage is that's read, her response is always, "Oh, that's my favorite." And I don't think she knows that she says it every single time. Well, I have to confess that as I looked up the readings for this morning, my first response was not, "Oh, these are my favorite." But there are wonderful inspirational points that are made in these passages. Deuteronomy paints a beautiful portrait of God's desire to bless God's people. In the context of the covenant, the Israelites are promised that if they will obey the ordinances of the law, God will bless and increase the fruit of their flocks and of their fields and even their wombs. They're promised health, they're promised land, they're promised possessions. It sounds great, but it also sounds a little bit to me like a prosperity gospel. If you do your part, God's going to make you rich. And then when I get to that last line, "You shall devour all the peoples that the Lord your God is giving over to you, showing them no pity." Well, so I turn to Titus, and I get really excited about the encouragement that is given to this young preacher. Teach, declare, exhort, rebuke. You have the authority. Trust your calling, trust your ministry, and don't let anybody look down on you. And the virtues that Titus is charged to encourage in his congregation, well, they're right out of moral theology and foundations of Christian spirituality. Self-control, prudence, temperance, fidelity, love, faith, endurance. These are all good and important qualities. And yet there's something about the way they're divvied up between male and female, old and young, slave and free, that doesn't sit quite right with me. And then that bit, of course, about submission, specifically for women and for slaves. Well, I don't like to think of myself as someone who has any enemies. And in the psalm, the psalmist is pleading with God for refuge, for deliverance from enemies and from persecutors. And I think to myself that if I did have enemies, it would be the sort of people who take passages like Deuteronomy and Titus and use them to denigrate or devalue or dismiss whole categories of people. So how does this word speak to us today? And then I think of the Word made flesh, Jesus of Nazareth. When the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, the Word was questioned by us, debated by us, in dialogue with us. Perhaps that same dynamic of dialogue and debate exists in the written Word as well. So while our passage of Deuteronomy speaks of promises of health and possessions and wealth and promotes, arguably, genocide, Isaiah speaks of the suffering of the innocent and of Israel's call to be a blessing to all nations. Where Titus's mentor speaks of the submission of women, Paul acknowledges and affirms the deacon Phoebe and the teacher Priscilla and other women leaders of the early church. And the debate and dialogue doesn't stop here. Luke Powery, who we read in homiletics, says that the Word is always incarnate, even in human voices and bodies, that the Word takes on the flesh of the preacher to speak the good news of God. So each of us participates actively in this dialogue, in this debate. We are called to be in dialogue with God through Scripture on behalf of and with our congregations. My prayer for us today is that as we engage in dialogue with this conversation partner, that we and our parishes will find this also to be our favorite.